Knowledge is a good thing, even an excellent and highly necessary thing, in fact. The more we learn, and thus the more we know, the further we can advance as a society. Our collective gains in knowledge have allowed humanity to develop countless life-saving medical treatments, enabled instantaneous global communication and near-effortless international travel, and even let us reach to the stars. But knowledge is not a good that should be sought after at any cost and without limit. Much of the knowledge we have today, especially in the medical field, was obtained through horribly unethical means. There is also the false assumption that having the power of near infinite knowledge at our fingertips, or rather, in our pocket, will lead to us being a wiser and more enlightened people. That notion could hardly be further from the truth. So today, let's examine the story of two men of great intellect, power, and authority who were brought to ruin by their unyielding and unquenchable thirst for knowledge. The first of this pair is, as the video's title suggests, Denethor, son of Ecthelion, lord and steward of Gondor. A rather insecure man, one who both coveted and loathed his station beneath the empty throne at Minas Tirith.
Rule of Gondor is mine!
Knowing that he could never rise from his seat to that of the king. So instead, he seized the vestige of kingly power that remained within Minas Tirith, the Palantir, the seeing stone that allowed him to perceive events across Middle-earth, knowing that what he witnessed in that stone was true and real. Denethor took great pride in the knowledge he gleaned from that Palantir. When Gandalf brings him news of Theoden's victory and Saruman's overthrow, this was the steward's response. I know already sufficient of these deeds for my own counsel against the menace of the East. Then, after a brief staring contest with Gandalf, he lets out a bald-faced lie. For though the stones be lost, they say, still the lords of Gondor have keener sight than lesser men, and many messages come to them. Denethor continues this trend in a later conversation with Gandalf as they discuss the imminent war that Mordor will bring against Gondor. For myself, I have long known who is the chief captain of the hosts of the Dark Tower. Is that all you have returned to say? Or can it be that you have withdrawn because you are overmatched? For the record, Gandalf would obliterate the Witch King in a 1v1. He's basically a hard counter to the Nazgul, his presence bolstering the spirits of Gondor soldiers against the Nazgul debuff wherever he goes. This scene from the movie is absolute nonsense and Istari slander to boot. Anyway, Denethor wasn't quite done disparaging Gandalf, who has just informed him of a second army issuing forth from the Black Gate. Some have accused you, Mithrandir, of delighting to bear ill news, but to me, this is no longer news. It was known to me ere nightfall yesterday. Now, obviously, the first-time reader like Gandalf himself doesn't know the true source of Denethor's knowledge, but that doesn't matter so much right now. What is far more telling is that Denethor cares more about the simple fact that he knows things than he does about the army of bloodthirsty orcs about to descend on his city. In my intro, I said that knowledge is a good, but that it is only because it can be used to do good. Knowledge that is hoarded and locked away is pointless and useless. Worse, it is often corrupting. If a man knows many things but has no practical application for them, or at least lacks the wisdom to apply his knowledge, what is he to do? A humble man would realize that he does in fact know very little, and seek to change his ways, to put the gift that he's been given to actual use. The proud man simply seeks more knowledge, asserting to himself and others that merely knowing things is the mark of a wise man and a good leader. To some extent, Denethor appears to have convinced the men who serve him of that lie. As Baragond, one of the Tower Guard, tells Pippin, the Lord Denethor is unlike other men. He sees far. Some say that as he sits alone in his high chamber in the tower at night and bends his thought this way and that, he can read somewhat of the future, and that he will at times search even the mind of the enemy wrestling with him. If it sounds like a terrible idea to get into a cognitive grappling match with an immortal demigod who is hell-bent on destroying everything and everyone you love, congratulations, you are wiser than Denethor. Yes, wiser. If you know things, if you store facts in your mind, if you have a solid grasp of logic and understand complex mathematical equations, congratulations, you have knowledge. But if you don't have wisdom, it is all for naught. Now, wisdom in this sense would typically mean knowing how to effectively apply that knowledge. And one would think that Denethor, a man accustomed to war and all the strategies involved, he helped retake Osgiliath as a younger man, according to Baragond, would be able to aptly apply all the knowledge which the Palantir provided him. Unfortunately for Denethor, wisdom means more than simply practically applying what you know. It also means knowing what you don't know, or rather understanding that there are gaps in your knowledge, that you do not have the full picture, no matter how many facts you have crammed into your brain. This is where Denethor took a crucial misstep. He assumed that the visions he received through the Palantir were the fullness of truth, rather than simply pieces of it. Now, to be clear, what he saw was true. The Seeing Stones do not lie, and not even the Lord of Barad-dûr can make them do so. He can, maybe, by his will choose what things shall be seen by weaker minds, or cause them to mistake the meaning of what they saw. Nonetheless, it cannot be doubted that when Denethor saw great forces arrayed against him in Mordor, and more still being gathered, he saw that which truly is. This war is then without final hope, as Denethor perceived. Victory cannot be achieved by arms. Denethor allowed the incomplete and skewed perception of events which he had perceived through the Palantir to drive him to despair. Sauron merely had to subtly convince and manipulate the steward that this Seeing Stone would provide all the knowledge he could possibly attain, and that his only path to victory was through said knowledge. And since, as Gandalf explained, the steward perceived that the forces of Mordor were simply too great in number and strength for the men of the West to overcome in battle, Denethor committed one final folly. He lost hope.
Gondor is lost. There is no hope for men.
Why? Why do the fools fly? Said Denethor. Better to burn sooner than late, for burn we must. To hope is to desire ultimate happiness, and yet at the same time to realize that our own strength will prove insufficient for the attainment of such joy. That virtue is absolutely fundamental to the entire story of the Lord of the Rings. Frodo's quest was not one he could ultimately accomplish. He knew, as far as his reason could assess, that it was a hopeless mission, but he embarked on it anyway, because what else could he do? Theoden resolved to ride out and meet the enemy not once but twice, even if death and defeat seemed certain. If Aragorn had shrunk back from the battle with the armies of Mordor, had declined to march to the Black Gate because he rightly judged that his armies could not win by strength of arms, had refused to hope that somehow his failure would lead to an unimaginable victory, then Sauron's conquest of Middle-earth would have been certain. If there's one message that you take away from Tolkien's masterpiece, let it be this: never lose hope. Denethor believed that by gaining knowledge he could save his people, and when that failed, he could see no way forward. He allowed his folly of knowledge to drive all hope from his heart, and thus lost all will to live, to fight, to do what a man must do when faced with great evil. Our second case study shares with Denethor the misguided belief that knowledge is the ultimate answer to all of our questions, trials, and difficulties. Knowledge, as the saying goes, is power, the one thing that prideful and greedy men have lusted for above all else since the dawn of time. Power is control, and if we can control every aspect of our circumstances, our lives, and our very existence, well, wouldn't that just be fantastic? That's certainly what Odin seems to think.
We could find out why we're here, learn how to change our fates, stop Ragnarok for good, maybe. Save the people we love.
Now, I don't mean to equate Denethor and Odin on a moral level. Denethor was clearly a good man who was corrupted by the desire to use an evil or at least impure and untrustworthy means to obtain a noble end, to save his people. If that sounds like Boromir, well duh, the man's his father. Odin, however, is a malicious, duplicitous, conniving little worm who doesn't give a rat's ass about anyone other than himself. He uses everyone who will trust him or obey him to further his goals, regardless of the consequences for their own well-being.
Honestly, I liked you better as a drunk.
But both men do fall victim to a similar misunderstanding, a misguided belief that if they simply know enough, they will be able to achieve their every goal. And perhaps Odin would have. Personally, I theorize that actually looking into the terror mask or no mask would have destroyed him. Or perhaps if Atreus had, it would have turned him into a twisted eldritch monster, which would have obliterated everything in his path, but that's not really relevant here. Like Denethor, Odin is vastly insecure, despite being a man of immeasurable power and influence. He's the Allfather, the god who created the very realms in which they all live, and yet he is horribly afraid of the unknown and of anyone who might challenge him. The more powerful and knowledgeable that we become, the more jealous we often become of our own power and knowledge. If we have exerted exacting control over our life, but realize that there remains one area which we cannot control, what are we to do? Well, if we're Odin, we chase after that minute, apparently unclaimed sliver of power like it's the only thing that matters in the entire world, ignoring everyone else who needs us in pursuit of our own perceived good. A good that Odin is certain he can obtain if he just gets answers, if he unlocks the source of assumed infinite knowledge. As we saw with Denethor, such assumptions are foolish. When we don't know what we don't know, how can we be at all certain that unlocking new knowledge will guide us toward the answers we seek? It is entirely possible, if not extremely likely, that receiving an unimaginable amount of new information would simply break your brain, or at least would make all the questions you were asking and the problems you were looking to solve seem pitifully insignificant. It's hard to say for sure, but what is certain, as displayed in these two tales, is that chasing after knowledge can easily become a perilous pursuit, and that if a source of knowledge appears to offer easy answers, or every answer to any question that you could ever ask, that source is likely something best left alone.
Shortcuts always have a price.
Because, ultimately, we are not unchallenged masters of our own fate. We cannot achieve ultimate power that will let us control each and every aspect of our lives. To attempt to do so is to fall victim to our pride and our lust for power and control, and to reject the all-important virtue of hope. Instead, we must remember this one simple fact.
Even the very wise cannot see all ends.
Stories like The Lord of the Rings, and to a lesser but significant extent God of War Ragnarok, matter so much, in large part due to the incredible displays of virtue and growth of the various heroes. Watching a man forgive himself for his sins and seek redemption, choose to reject despair and take up arms against all odds because it is right, or press forward even when it will cost him everything, is incredibly moving, inspiring, and edifying. But not every character can have such a glorious and noble story. Some must fall. But even in their failures and despondency, they can still mean something. They might make us wonder what could have been if they had made different choices. And quite often, we see ourselves in them. We see our own flaws and vices amplified and intensified, perhaps far more than we see our own virtues in the heroes who are truly larger than life. The more I read, think, and talk about these stories, especially Lord of the Rings, the more I come to love them. J.R.R. Tolkien created a masterpiece that I will never fully understand or appreciate, and I'm okay with that. But I also know that every time I revisit the pages of this wonderful novel, I will come to know it a little bit better. I will glean another tidbit of wisdom ingrained in the world and the characters, and every single time, whatever new information or enlightenment I have gained, this story never fails to reinforce one of its most central themes. I am not enough. I cannot do it all. I will never know it all, and that is as it should be. The world may be dark and getting darker, but my job is not to overcome that darkness. Instead, I simply need to fight that darkness, to love those whom I am called to love as best I can, and, of course, to hope.